The next section we're going to cover here is relative sizing and also estimating the size of stories. So what is relative sizing at its core? Really, it's experience-based estimating. This is something that all of us have done for the majority of our adult-based lives. We do it on a daily basis, as a matter of fact. And it's interesting because it's also a reason why we can have very quick and very precise transactions with very little information or detail. It's a reason that it's very valuable for us in the development world. So let's look at a few things here. If we had to look at 3 cups of coffee, let's talk about relative sizing. When you go in the morning, you go to work, or when we did go to work, before we were all working remotely, we would go in and we would maybe go to the drive-through. I love Dunkin' Donuts, so I would go to the Dunkin' Donuts drive-through, and I know what kind of coffee I want. I like my coffee in the morning. I'd want a large coffee. I know how much it costs. I know how much coffee I'm going to get. The person on the other end knows what I'm ordering. They work at Dunkin' Donuts. They do the coffee. So our transaction happens in a matter of minutes, depending on how many people want their coffee in the morning, depending on how big the line is, right? But essentially, you have a very fast transaction to have something happen where both sides are very satisfied. They get exactly what they want out of the experience in a very quick manner. And it happens between 2 people that have never really ever met before in most cases. So this is a very, very interesting thing when you think about relative sizing. If you were to look at these 3 cups, looking here, would you say that the one on the right is smaller than the one on the left? No, your experience tells you that you look at these 3 cups and the smallest one's on the left, the middle one's in the middle, and the largest one's on the right. What tells you that? Well, it's your experience. Nothing, there's no data there. It's 3 pictures, but what's telling you which one's bigger and which one's not? Well, one on the right side looks bigger than the one on the left side, and the one in the middle looks like it's in between the 2 sizes, right? So if you were to think about this in terms of different ways of measuring, absolute on these cups would be 10 ounces, 14 ounces, and 18 ounces. Relative sizing, in their case, when you go to order us, when I drive through the drive-through, I say small, medium, or large, right? What do you want? Would you like a small, medium, or large, sir? I'd like a large. Great. I don't order an 18-ounce cup of coffee. If I did, and try this sometime when you're going through the drive-through, next time you ever get to go through a drive-through, go and ask them for a certain ounce coffee. Find out what the coffee is. And they'll probably have to look at the cups and figure out which one that is. Or say, do you mean a large? You may hear them come back with that. They're not used to that. There's a pattern that you've established with this transaction. You say, there's a small, medium, and large on the menu. The person on the other end is used to hearing, I want a large. You get the large. You see the price. You know the price. You agree on the price. You agree on the size. Transaction happens. Everybody's happy. In this case, we're going to talk about story points. Now, story points is another relative sizing thing, right? Small, medium, and large is a relative term, right? Large at Dunkin' Donuts is not large at 7-Eleven. At 7-Eleven, a big gulp is like 48 ounces. A large at Dunkin' Donuts is 18 ounces. So a large isn't a large for everybody. They're different sizes. In this, the story points are much the same. At Dunkin' Donuts, it's always 10 ounces, 14 ounces, and 18 ounces, small, medium, large. It's the same every time I go there. Now, if I go someplace else, I might be disappointed when I get a large because it may be different. So, but their relative sizing for them, for that establishment, for that business, is that size. Story points are much the same way. If I'm on a development team and I size things a certain way and I say, hey, a SQL script that I write is a 1. And if I write a simple function in something, with it, regardless of the language I'm doing, if I do something very simple, it's a 3. If I get something that's a little more complex, it's a 5. And I've done this thing before that's kind of large. Things that are usually about that amount of effort and complexity, we typically call them an 8. It's a way of sizing something in a very relative way. Now, this is another example of relative sizing. If you go to 3 different coffee places, and I've been to Tim Hortons, love that. Not much of a Starbucks fan myself, but very popular out there. Which one of these cups is larger? It's very hard to tell, right? Because they're very, very close. In relative terms, They're probably, based on the data that we can gather on this slide, which is visual only, right? Based on that data, you'd say they were probably about the same size. Now, one could be zoomed in, one could be out. You don't have that data. You have to go on the data you have. That's really key. So in this case, the absolute size on these is 10 ounces, 12 ounces, and 8 ounces. In the relative size, at each store, this is their smallest cup of coffee that they have. So at each place you would go and you would order a small. And in the case of the different stores, they even have a different language for this, right? So at Dunkin' Donuts, a small is a small, the company size. If you look at the company size at Starbucks, a small is a tall, which, okay, I think that's a little odd, but that's the way they go. And anybody that goes to Starbucks knows that. In fact, what I would call a Starbucks aficionado would look at you funny if you ordered a tall as a small going to Starbucks. They'd be like, well, you obviously don't order here very often, do you? No, I don't. I don't know that a tall is a small when I go in there. I just say, give me the smallest cup. I don't say 12 ounces. I don't say tall. I say, give me the smallest one. You go to a Tim Hortons, if you're in Quebec, somewhere up in French-speaking Canada, it's a petite. Right? That's what they would call it right there, because that's the French version of small. So again, same relative size. If you were to look at the exact ounces in each cup, the relative size that you would term it in your own language would be small, but each company calls it something different. So relative sizing can be very valuable, but what makes it valuable is knowing and understanding the pattern and the consistency. Imagine if I went to Dunkin' Donuts every day and they kept changing the size of the cup. I would be ordering a large and getting something different every day. The price would be different. I would be very upset with that. That wouldn't be good. I wouldn't know what to do. I'd probably be frustrated enough that I'd go to a different place to start buying coffee. This is what happens if you try to do experience-based or relative sizing and you're not consistent. What makes relative sizing work is consistency. It is critical to making it happen. It's not the amount of precision that you put into it. It's not that it's 10 ounces, 12 ounces, 8 ounces. It's that, hey, each one of these might be a little off, but if I'm sizing it relatively, I'm getting really the amount of, I couldn't tell you if I got a 10 ounce versus a 12 ounce that I got a different amount of cup of coffee. I couldn't tell you that. The same way a user couldn't tell that they got something that was 2 ounces bigger or smaller based on the way that you had to develop it. They just know that they got what they wanted. It fits the size that they were looking for. It fits the cost they were looking for. They're getting what they expected. And as long as you build that reputation of being consistent with this, relative sizing can create an environment, just like through a drive-through with coffee, that gives you an incredibly quick transaction, very accurate, very predictable, and as precise as it needs to be able to have very successful transactions in a sustainable, ongoing way. So it's really, really key. So let's talk about that in terms of going back to stories. What does that mean when we're estimating and sizing stories and we're talking about relative sizing? We want to typically look at it, if we're talking about software, we're talking about it, looking at it as coding estimates only. So we're looking at that as saying, this is how much code we're going to do. Yes, there's the occasion where there's a simple line of SQL script or some kind of simple one-liner or two-liner that we'll put into a very complex system that will cause us to have to do an immense amount of testing to make sure that something didn't work. Maybe it's an antiquated system, and every time we touch it, it's very brittle, and we have to make sure that we do such things. So, but most of the time, it's usually the effort to code something. So we want to assume the relative complexity correlates to all the effort to get the story done, including analysis and QA that's involved. So even though it's at the coding estimate, these things tend to work out in the end. If I'm doing a certain type of project in one space of a software and I do something in a different space, once I've got experience doing those things, if I go back and do something that I feel like with my experience, again, this is experience-based estimating, with my experience, I think it's going to be about the same amount of effort, which means it's probably going to take about the same amount of time. I will give it the same size, even though the work may not be the same. But that's okay, because what counts in the end is not how many ounces of coffee I get. What counts is, did I get somebody what they expected, and did I get it to them on time with no bugs, with no issues, and it does what they're looking to do. In the coffee case, it gets me my coffee, the amount that I want for the price that I want, right? In terms of software, it gets me the feature functionality I want in a timely enough effort, but it also works, and it works sustainably, and it doesn't do anything to muck anything else up. So sizing, therefore, we talk about units. This is this idea around story points. There are things like ideal day estimates. We can measure what reality is. We can talk about doubling each size of the previous. We can look at different things. We're going to talk a little bit about poker planning and about sizing in those units as well. So story estimating and sizing, again, relative sizes. When you think about a story, when a story is brand new and it doesn't have a lot of detail, a lot of technical stuff, say it just came from stakeholders, the product owner's just learning about this stuff, a lot of times people will use very simplistic sizing in terms of this. They'll look at it as being something that's small, medium, large, extra large. They call it a t-shirt size. You see these little t-shirts here. Sometimes it's these areas, extra small to extra large. A lot of times they use 5 sizes. Getting really granular doesn't help that much, does it? Because you don't see 16 sizes of cups of coffee at the Dunkin' Donuts. You see 3. Why? Because 3 satisfies 99% of the needs. And the people that would want something in between would probably only order it if it existed. The fact that there's only 3, they're going to find one of those 3 that fits. At this point, being any more granular, any more detailed than that, giving them 13 ounces instead of 11 ounces is not going to make a difference to them in terms of getting what they want and the delight that they receive from getting it. So looking at this, there's another way they talk about tall, grande, venti, trente. This is the Starbucks model. If you look at it from the standpoint of different sizes at Starbucks, again, they have their own naming convention for the sizes. If you go to Starbucks, you know that naming convention. It's ingrained in what you do. If you don't and you walk in there, it's confusing as heck. If you're a Dunkin' Donuts person like me. So, but what's key here is that it's simple. It's simple, and people can learn and get to learn and understand and agree on what this is. And over time, you build out what small is for you. Now, think about this in terms of different teams. If there's a team over here doing certain types of work for a company and another team doing other types of work for another company, they're in their own environments. Imagine that their own stores. One's Dunkin' Donuts and one is Starbucks. They both produce coffee, right? Maybe a little different flavor, and they have different nomenclatures. They have different vernacular, different words that they use for their sizing. That's okay if they're consistent. They can absolutely do that. Now, when there's integration efforts, we don't get into all the details around this. There are many different ways to handle this stuff, but what we want to do is introduce to you the idea, the concept around story estimating and sizing, and the fact that it's relative to the place that's the group that's doing it, and it's relative to the customers that are receiving that. And in which case, a product owner would need to be very versed in what those are for each group. So let's talk about planning poker. Planning poker is a way, which created by James Grenning and out of some frustration that he had on trying to get his team members involved in actually talking about the sizing of things. He created this more fun way to get people kind of involved in this. But what's cool about it, it's not only fun, but it's fast, it's lightweight, it's very repeatable. It helps build that consistency and repetitiveness that makes relative sizing work really, really well. And it allows different people, different talent groups that are involved in developing and building something, including the what side with the product owner, to understand this stuff, but all the different people on the how side that do something, whether it's architects or UX or all these other things that are involved in this, to be able to talk about it in terms of the way that they're thinking about it with their subject matter expertise. So you don't have to have a team that's very, very familiar with everything about what's going on. However, if you're doing this for a lot of time, you'll start to learn that this effort over here to do this type of thing, even though you don't do it, when John gives his estimates on these things, he usually gives an estimate around 5 for this type of work. I've seen him do it before. So when I hear that kind of work, I kind of get an idea of what that's going to be. It's a great way to learn about how complicated and how much effort it takes to do certain things, even when it's not your skill set. So you get to learn from your peers, you get to learn from your teammates as to what complicates and what makes things more difficult, what's simple to do, and how much effort and size and time it takes to get things done. So it's a relative size, again, just like the coffee cups, just like small, medium, and large. Those sizes, a 3 for one team could be an 8 on another team. Just like small, tall, petite, all of these different things can be called different things. It's the exact same concept. That's fine. It works perfectly fine. And we're not going to go into it in any more detail today, but there's a lot on Planning Poker. It is a great way to start relative sizing. And frankly, as you know, driving through a drive-through is a very fast, efficient, and repeatable, sustainable, effective way to get things done, to get a cup of coffee, to get whatever you want. It's also good for us in the software world and in any world where we have to deliver something on a repetitive basis. We have to do this thing over and over again. So Lean Dog has an app out there. It's both on the iTunes and on the Google Play. We have our own cards that you can use. There's different cards for different things. We're going to talk about different efforts in there. You're seeing here, there's a few different types of cards. But the t-shirt sizes, the one that's up on the left-hand side there, that is some of the relative sizing that we can do. I believe on those cards, there's also a modified Fibonacci sequence, which is what you saw here in this thing, this 0 to 100. Grenig used a modified Fibonacci to go ahead and figure this out because it was a nice, easy way for the team to start to understand if something's a 1 versus a half. Some teams say, well, it's probably twice the size, it's twice the effort, but it gave a nice spread that it started to say, how much granularity do you really need in order to get to something where you know it's the right size to work on? It starts to go up exponentially, just like a modified Fibonacci does, simply because at a certain point, it's just getting really big and it's too big to talk about. We need to talk about it further and break it down before it's ready to go in. Sizing has an important part in deciding when things go in and when they're ready to go. Remember, we talked about invest. Size is part of that invest decision-making tree in terms of, are things ready to be into delivery, into development, to start working on them, or do we still need to talk about it some more? Do we need more communication and collaboration? This helps you figure that out. So this is really kind of our review for this section around relative sizing and around estimating in terms of story cards.